German U-boat service. North Atlantic. 1943. Night hours after the last depth charge attack. The sea finally went still. For the first time in hours, nothing slammed into the hull. No sonar pings cut through the water overhead. No propellers throbbed in the distance, lining up for another pass. Inside the submarine, the silence didn't feel lucky, it felt earned. The captain let himself breathe. The escorts had been relentless. Their depth charges came in tight, aggressive patterns, one run after another, but the boat had done what it was built and trained to do. Slow turns, careful speed changes, long stretches of absolute quiet. Every drilled habit had paid off, just as the manuals promised. They slipped away. The batteries were low but usable. The air was foul but safe. There was no serious damage. The boat was intact, still alive, and most importantly, alone. The captain gave the order to surface. Compressed air hissed through the ballast tanks as the U-boat began to rise. It broke the surface smoothly, the dark hull barely visible against darker water. No searchlights snapped on, no gunfire followed. The horizon was empty. The mood shifted instantly. Shoulders dropped, voices crept louder. Someone lit a cigarette on the bridge despite the rules. A quiet laugh broke out, not reckless, just relieved. Whatever came next, the worst seemed behind them. This was the moment U-boat crews lived for. A clean escape. They struck, survived the chase, and taken no real damage. By every traditional measure, this was success. The captain logged the evasion and prepared to recharge the batteries under cover of night. Below, the radio operator settled into routine checks. Nearby traffic was sparse, no threats, no urgency. It felt like the enemy had finally let go. Then a signal came through. It wasn't addressed to the submarine. It wasn't meant for German ears at all. It was Allied traffic, faint, broken but unmistakable. Calm exchanges between escort groups, coordinates, bearings, speed estimates, nothing rushed, nothing panicked. And one line that stopped the room cold. Contact maintained. The radio operator read it again. Then again. They hadn't lost the submarine. They just stopped chasing it the old way. Depth charges had failed, yes, but tracking hadn't. Radio intelligence, convoy coordination, pattern analysis, all of it had continued quietly in the background. The escorts weren't following sound anymore. They were closing in on likelihood. The understanding spread through the boat, slow and heavy. The silence outside wasn't abandonment. It was patience. The captain returned to the bridge and swept the horizon once more. Still nothing, no lights, no gun flashes, no movement. But the quiet had changed. It wasn't empty anymore. It felt watchful. Somewhere out there, Allied ships were adjusting course, already reacting to information the U-boat crew didn't realize they'd given away. The celebration faded without a word. The clean escape had never been real. The submarine had surfaced, believing the hunt was over. In truth, it had risen into a net that had never fully tightened or fully loosened. And the most dangerous moment of the night was about to begin. Not when the U-boat was deep and silent, but when it believed it was finally safe. What the U-boat crew didn't understand was that the chase had changed long before it felt like it was over. By 1943, Allied anti-submarine warfare no longer relied on a single line of contact. Sonar was just one tool, and when it faded, others slipped in without anyone making a fuss. The escorts hadn't lost the submarine. They'd simply stopped chasing it head-on. During the depth charge attacks, every move the U-boat made left a trail. Speed changes, course shifts, estimated depth. Even the moments of silence meant something. When sonar contact dropped, it didn't vanish into uncertainty, it narrowed into likelihood. Allied commanders weren't asking, "Where is the submarine right now?" They were asking, "Where does it have to go next?" That shift showed up in the intercepted radio traffic. There was no panic, no frantic searching, just calm exchanges between escort groups, probable surfacing windows, battery limits, likely recharge areas. The Atlantic had turned into a map of restrictions. Allied doctrine rested on one simple assumption: a submarine that survived a long pursuit would eventually have to surface. Batteries drained, air ran thin, staying silent always came at a price. So the escorts waited. Instead of looping aimlessly, they spread out along the most likely exit routes. Some ships hadn't dropped a single depth charge during the attack, but they were now part of the trap, moving deliberately to close gaps rather than chase shadows. That's why the U-boat surfacing felt so safe. No sonar followed it up. No guns swung in its direction. No searchlights sliced through the dark. Because the Allies didn't need to reveal themselves. The hunt continued over the radio. Convoy escorts coordinated with distant patrols. Bearings were shared, timelines compared. The submarine's escape path wasn't guessed, it was boxed in. From the bridge, the sea looked empty. From the Allied command picture, it was full of purpose. The most dangerous mistake the German crew made wasn't believing they'd evaded the attack. It was believing that evasion meant freedom. By surfacing immediately, the submarine confirmed everything the Allies had predicted. Battery exhaustion lined up, probable positions locked into place. The net drew tighter without a single shot fired. What felt like victory below deck was, to the enemy, confirmation. The Allies hadn't lost contact. They'd changed how they held it. And now, instead of reacting to the submarine's moves, they were waiting for it to reveal itself, just as doctrine said it eventually would. The escape didn't fail because of a single error. It failed because the war had become quieter, slower, and far less forgiving. The U-boat survived the chase. It didn't survive the thinking that came afterward. The submarine remained on the surface longer than planned. At first that felt reasonable. Batteries needed charging, fresh air cycled through the hull, engines ran smoothly again, nothing on the horizon suggested danger. No searchlights, no flares, no distant gunfire. Silence felt like proof. Inside the boat, routine returned in fragments. Crewmen moved more freely. The tension that had knotted shoulders during the depth charge attacks began to loosen. The captain reviewed charts, already thinking ahead to the next patrol area. That was when the silence turned suspicious. Experienced submariners knew the Atlantic well enough to recognize patterns, not just of sound, but of behavior. Escorts rarely abandoned a hunt completely after investing so much effort. Yet here, there was no sign of random searching, no overlapping sonar sweeps, no distant propellers blundering through the dark. The ocean was too quiet. Below deck, the radio operator continued to monitor Allied traffic. Maury fragments slipped through, routine, unemotional, precise. They were not calling for reinforcements. They were confirming positions, adjusting timing, passing estimates. The words themselves were harmless. The structure was not. This was not the language of ships that had lost contact. It was the language of ships that no longer needed it. The captain began to understand the trap forming, not around the submarine's current position, but around its future. The Allies were no longer asking where the U-boat was. They were assuming where it had to be. Surface submarines left signatures even in darkness. Exhaust smoke, engine noise, radar reflections, faint but real. Every minute on the surface sharpened the Allied picture. The submarine was not hiding. It was advertising. Orders were given to prepare to dive again, but urgency had returned too late. The boat had already confirmed Allied assumptions about timing and location. Even a perfect crash dive now would only delay the inevitable. This was the hidden danger of a clean escape. The crew had survived the loud phase of the hunt, the explosions, the sonar, the violence. They had mistaken that for the end. What they were entering now was the quiet phase where the enemy no longer needed to rush. The Allies had patience. They could afford to wait. Somewhere beyond the horizon, destroyers were altering course with calm precision. Patrol aircraft adjusted search boxes. No one needed to see the submarine to close in on it. The realization settled heavily through the boat. The escape had worked tactically. Strategically, it had failed. The submarine had not disappeared into the Atlantic. It had surfaced into a battle space where silence no longer meant safety, and where being unseen was far less important than being predicted. And prediction, once confirmed, was far harder to outrun than sonar pings or depth charges. The order to dive came without hesitation, but with a quiet sense of inevitability. Ballast valves opened, engines cut, men moved with trained precision as the submarine began to slip back beneath the surface. From a technical standpoint, the dive was clean, no alarms, no collisions, no frantic shouting. But timing matters more than technique. The U-boat disappeared just as it always had, but this time disappearance carried no advantage. The Allies did not need to hear the dive. They did not need to see it. They already knew when it would happen and roughly where. That knowledge changed everything. Below the surface, the submarine returned to quiet running. Speed was reduced, course held steady. The captain hoped to slide out of the predicted box before the net closed fully. Above, Allied escorts were already moving. They were not converging on a single point. They were sealing space. Each ship adjusted course slightly, narrowing lanes the submarine might use. This was not pursuit driven by contact, it was containment driven by expectation. Sonar contact flickered briefly, then vanished again. No one panicked. That was the tell. Normally, a lost contact triggered aggressive searching, tight circles, overlapping sweeps, escalating pressure. This time, nothing dramatic happened. Escorts held course. Speeds remained steady. Radio traffic stayed calm. They were waiting for the submarine to make the next necessary move. Inside the U-boat, tension returned heavier than before. Batteries were already partially drained from the earlier evasion. Air quality had improved during surfacing, but now that air was being consumed again with no guarantee of another safe recharge window. The boat could hide. It could not hide forever. The captain faced a narrowing set of options. Slow movement conserved battery but limited escape. Faster movement risked detection. Changing depth risked revealing patterns. Every choice fed the same problem, time. Depth charges began to fall again, but not immediately overhead. They were placed deliberately off to the side, then further along the projected path. Not attacks meant to destroy, but messages meant to steer. Each pattern suggested, "We know where you're going." This was the psychological weight of modern anti-submarine warfare. The U-boat was no longer being hunted in the old sense. It was being managed. The crew realized now what the intercepted signals had truly meant. The Allies had never lost the submarine. They had simply allowed it to believe it was free long enough to surface and confirm every assumption about its condition. The clean escape had been real. So was the trap that followed it. And now, deep again in the Atlantic, the U-boat faced the most dangerous phase of the engagement, not the chaos of pursuit, but the calm certainty of an enemy that had already solved the problem. The next explosions were different. They were not frantic. They were not close. They were not meant to kill. Depth charges detonated at measured intervals, spaced just far enough apart to avoid wasting effort, just close enough to shape movement. Each blast carried the same message: "We know where you are going." Inside the U-boat, the effect was immediate. Men braced instinctively, but the real damage was psychological. These were not attacks driven by uncertainty. They were corrections. Each pattern landed ahead of the submarine's projected path, forcing course changes that narrowed options instead of opening them. The Allies were no longer searching. They were steering. The captain altered heading slightly, hopping to slip out of the pressure zone. Within minutes, another pattern fell, again not directly overhead, but precisely where the new course would have led. The realization hardened into certainty. The net was not tightening randomly. It was being adjusted. Battery levels dropped faster now. Quiet running limited speed. Air quality began to deteriorate again, undoing the brief relief of surfacing earlier. Every system aboard the submarine felt the strain of time being used against it. This was the phase U-boat crews feared most. Not violent pursuit. Not sudden destruction. Attrition. The escorts had no reason to rush. They had fuel. They had numbers. They had coordination. Most importantly, they had confidence that the submarine would be forced to act eventually, either to surface, change depth aggressively, or attempt a breakout that would reveal itself. The U-boat could choose when to fail. It could not choose whether. Depth charges continued, never overwhelming, never absent, just enough to deny rest, just enough to remind the crew that every minute underwater was being tracked, estimated, and planned for. The captain understood now how the escape had truly failed. Surfacing had not broken contact. It had completed the equation. The Allies now knew the submarine's battery state, air cycle, and likely endurance. What remained was simply to wait for physics to do its work. In the control room, no one spoke about victory anymore. They spoke about management, how long they could stay deep, how much power remained, how many decisions were left before the sea itself decided. The ocean outside was calm. Inside the hull, the pressure was mounting, not from water, but from inevitability. The clean escape was over. What followed was the part no one celebrated. The slow realization that being allowed to run was sometimes worse than being chased. Inside the submarine, time stopped feeling neutral. Every minute now carried weight. Battery meters dropped in small, relentless increments. Carbon dioxide levels crept upward, subtle at first, then noticeable. Condensation coated steel surfaces, dripping steadily, turning the boat into a closed, breathing system slowly working against itself. The captain faced a narrowing set of choices. Increase speed and risk noise. Hold speed and accept capture by endurance. Change depth and reveal a pattern. None of these were solutions, they were delays. The Allies understood this perfectly. The depth charges continued at intervals that were almost polite, never close enough to rupture the hull, never far enough to allow rest. Each pattern forced a correction. Each correction burned power. This was not harassment. It was accounting. Above, escort commanders rotated ships calmly. Fuel was conserved. Sonar operators logged changes without urgency. No one expected a dramatic breakthrough. The submarine would surface again because it had to. Inside the U-boat, the mood shifted from confidence to calculation. Crewmen spoke less. Movements became economical. Watches were rotated not by schedule, but by fatigue. Every system was managed as if it might be the last time it was used. This was the phase no training truly prepared crews for, the moment when survival depended not on skill, but on arithmetic. The submarine was alive, but it was being outlasted. What unnerved the U-boat crew most was the enemy's restraint. There was no reckless charge, no desperate attempt to finish the kill quickly. The escorts behaved like men who already knew the ending and saw no reason to rush toward it. This patience defined late-war anti-submarine warfare. Instead of pressing for contact, Allied commanders preserved it indirectly. They held lanes, they denied space. They treated the Atlantic not as an open sea, but as a series of controlled corridors. The submarine could move, but only into places already considered. Every attempted deviation was met with a quiet response. A distant depth charge pattern a subtle sonar ping, a course adjustment above that closed yet another path. The escorts were not guessing. They were waiting. This was why the intercepted signals mattered so much. They revealed a mindset completely different from the one U-boat doctrine expected. The Allies did not measure success by explosions or immediate kills. They measured it by containment. As long as the submarine remained constrained, the outcome was already acceptable. Destruction was optional. Neutralization was enough. Inside the U-boat, this realization settled heavily. The enemy did not need to see them. It did not need to hear them clearly. It only needed to know that physics, endurance, and probability would finish the job. And those forces were already at work. Eventually, the numbers stopped favoring delay. Battery reserves reached a point where propulsion could no longer be sustained safely. Air quality dropped to levels that slowed reaction time and sharpened tempers. The submarine could remain hidden a little longer, but not long enough to escape. The captain understood the truth before anyone said it aloud. Another surface run was inevitable. Not because it was safe, but because it was necessary. This time there would be no illusion of escape. The Allies were expecting it. Somewhere above, ships were already positioned along likely surfacing arcs, prepared not to search, but to respond. When the order came, it carried no drama. Prepare to surface. Men moved automatically. Training replaced thought. The boat angled upward once more, not into darkness and relief, but into expectation. Above the water, the night was no longer empty. Lights flared in the distance. Propeller noise surged. The quiet that had defined the clean escape was gone, replaced by unmistakable presence. The submarine had reached the end of maneuver. What followed would not be evasion. It would be consequence. The surface became hostile instantly. Searchlights cut through darkness. Gunfire erupted without hesitation. The submarine had no time to orient, no window to choose direction. The Allies did not need confirmation. They already knew what was rising. The engagement was brief. Not because the U-boat lacked courage, but because courage had no room left to act. Fire came from multiple bearings. Maneuver was impossible. Every second on the surface increased exposure rather than opportunity. This was not a battle. It was enforcement. The U-boat crew fought as long as they could, returning fire, attempting evasive turns, but the outcome had been decided hours earlier when the escape was mistaken for freedom. The Allies did not celebrate. They did not rush. They executed. The submarine that had slipped away so cleanly earlier in the night was now fully visible, fully constrained, and fully outmatched. The German U-boat celebrated a clean escape because the signs were convincing. Silence returned. The ocean emptied. No pursuit followed immediately. In earlier years of the war, that would have been enough. By 1943, it was. The Allies no longer needed constant contact to maintain control. They used signals, probability, endurance, and patience. They allowed the submarine to believe it was free long enough to surface, reveal itself, and complete the enemy's calculations. The escape was real. The freedom was not. This was the quiet evolution of naval warfare. Battles were no longer decided by the loudest moments, but by what happened after them, by who understood that silence could be a tactic and patience a weapon. The most dangerous assumption a submarine crew could make was that evasion meant safety. Sometimes it only meant that the enemy had stopped chasing, because they were already waiting.